Chapter 8 Fallacies of Intimidation. Introduction. We call the three fallacies discussed in this chapter fallacies of intimidation because the types of arguments in which they occur tend to be perceived as putting pressure on their audience to accept the conclusion. Arguments from authority, for example, may seem to pressure us by appealing to our respect for experts and, generally, those more knowledgeable than we are. Arguments from popular opinion lean on our tendencies to groupthink and to be impressed by public opinion. By making dire projections about the future, arguments from the buildup of a chain of causes, from precedent, or from a combination of the two can stampede us into prematurely accepting a conclusion. Improper appeal to authority. We deem it a condition of individual autonomy and rationality that we acquire the capacity and motivation to investigate and evaluate the claims we are invited to adopt on the say-so of others. People who decide for themselves what to think are regarded as more fully realized human beings than are people who accept unquestioningly what others say. We are urged to be filters of opinions rather than sponges who soak them up indiscriminately. The capacity to interpret and assess arguments gets part of its rationale from this ideal because argument is a tool that can be used to test the quality of the support for a claim. Yet, it would be a mistake to picture the autonomous, self-guiding, belief-scrutinizing individual as a person who sets off completely independently, an isolated rational agent building up a system of beliefs by carefully checking and confirming each belief candidate before adding it to the store of trusted claims or discarding it as unverified or false. For one thing, the very classification and testing system such a person would have to use would themselves at some point just have to be accepted, at least for the time being. Otherwise, there would be an infinite regress of testing tests and testing concepts. For another, it is simply physically and mentally impossible for one person to verify everything. No single individual can have the time or the intelligence to do the job. Even scientists, the people best qualified to test empirical facts and theories, must routinely trust the word of other scientists in order to carry out their experimental research. Some scientific reports have dozens of co-authors, each of whom has checked out one specialized aspect of the report's claims, so that each must rely on the say-so of the others to produce the collective results. Or consider more down-to-earth information, phone numbers, weather forecasts, the times of high and low tide, product information, medical diagnoses, drug dosages, the scheduled times of TV shows, bus, train, and plane schedules, the dishes available in a restaurant, the music to be played at a concert, the way to assemble a barbecue, when to service a car, the meaning of a word or how it's spelled, or the biography of a celebrity. This list could continue indefinitely, and each of these items of information usually comes to us from someone else. We call this reliance on another person's observations, calculations, inferences, or judgments an appeal to authority. If what we have described above as our common situation is true, then, since we manage our cognitive lives reasonably well under these conditions, there appears to be no objection, in principle, to appealing to another's authority as the basis for a belief. Furthermore, we expect to find the authors of arguments citing the authority of others as support for their premises. In sum, the practice of appealing to authority in arguments is, in principle, perfectly legitimate. The kind of appeal to authority we are considering here is an appeal to authority in matters of belief or opinion. Such an authority is different from a political or administrative authority, the authority of a police officer to stop you if you're speeding, or of a teacher to require that you complete an assignment in order to pass a course. The latter are sources of commands or instructions regarding conduct, which is a different matter. In our references to authority hereafter, we shall be speaking only of the appeal to other sources to back up beliefs. The fallacy of improper appeal to authority occurs when the appeal is made in an argument under conditions that make such an appeal unreliable. We think it's most helpful to recognize these conditions as failures to meet the requirements of acceptable appeals to authority in arguments. There seem to be 4 general conditions that have to be satisfied if an appeal to authority is to be legitimate. We call them 1. Appropriateness, 2. Capability, 3. Consensus, and 4. Credibility. As you will see, these conditions are not on, off, or yes-no tests or requirements. Instead, they indicate dimensions along which an appeal to authority can range from totally improper at one extreme through degrees of increasing legitimacy up to complete propriety at the other extreme. Appropriateness. There are some kinds of assertions it is inappropriate to back up by an appeal to authority. You don't rely on a doctor to tell you that you have a headache, that you have dizzy spells, or that you dreamed last night. You don't rely on a food expert to tell you that you like the taste of broccoli but dislike mushrooms. No one else can choose your favorite colors or the music you enjoy. It is inappropriate to rely on another person's say-so to back up most claims about a person's subjective state. Similarly, with matters of religious faith, belief in God, highly speculative subjects where there isn't enough evidence to make a determination, the existence of unidentified flying objects, the possibility of extrasensory perception, or matters of personal judgment about which informed sources disagree, the relative significance of Bruce Springsteen and Michael Jackson in the world of popular music. All these are subjects where appeal to someone's say-so, even an expert's, is an inappropriate way to settle a disagreement or establish a claim. Consider some hypothetical cases. Suppose, for example, that someone claims that chemical additives in food are more harmful than helpful to human health. This is a claim about the nutritional value of chemical additives, a claim that belongs to the science of nutrition. A competent nutritionist should be able to tell us whether it is true or false, so it would be appropriate to try to support or refute such a statement by an appeal to authority. Or suppose someone asserts that Van Gogh painted The Starry Night at Saint-Rémy in Provence, France, in 1889. This statement belongs to the field of art history and, more specifically, to the specialty of the provenance of Van Gogh's paintings. A lot is known about where Van Gogh painted various works, so it would be appropriate to cite a source to back up or deny this claim. Suppose, however, that the statement was that Van Gogh had been able to locate more cathartic emotion in a vase of sunflowers than Gauguin, with his more refined symbolist sense of allegory, had been able to inject in dozens of figures. What sort of statement is this? It is an aesthetic judgment, one that presumes to rank Van Gogh's work above Gauguin's in terms of its amount of purifying emotion. Art historians and critics sometimes engage in this type of argument, making illuminating observations along the way, but they often disagree with one another about many of these contentions, for such judgments involve too much of an element of variable personal preference. So to back up the above claim by pointing out that art critic Robert Hughes thinks so, which he does, would be a violation of the appropriateness condition for appeals to authority. Do the cola commercials that seem to appeal to the authority of Bill Cosby or Wayne Gretzky meet the appropriateness condition? We would argue that they don't, because what is at issue is taste preference, a totally subjective affair. Capability. An appeal to authority can be legitimate only if the source knows what he or she is talking about. There are 2 aspects to knowing what you're talking about. Competence. If the claim in question belongs to theoretical physics, only a theoretical physicist would be in a position to know whether it's true. If the claim is about dairy farming practices, then only an experienced dairy farmer, or perhaps an agriculture scientist who specializes in dairy farming, can know whether it's true. A professional tennis player knows a lot about playing tennis, but not necessarily about cameras. Sorry, Mr. Agassi. Being a rock star doesn't give one the competence to judge the disappearance of the rainforests. Sorry, Sting. Notice what we tend to do when we get one recommendation from one doctor and a different recommendation from a second doctor. If the doctors are equally capable, we have no way to decide between them. One may be a general practitioner and the other a specialist in the area of medicine to which our condition belongs. In that case, we tend to give the specialist's advice greater weight. What we are doing, quite correctly, is relying on the authority whose credentials indicate greater capability. More on this point below. Opportunity. No matter how competent the specialist is, he or she is not capable of making an authoritative judgment about a particular claim without having had the opportunity to check it out. A biochemist might have the competence to carry out or understand tests of the nutritional value of certain food additives, but unless she's actually done the tests or read reports of such tests, she is not capable of making a judgment that should be treated as authoritative about the nutritional value of particular additives. Consensus. If an arguer backs up a claim with an appeal to one authority and you know of another authority who holds the opposite view, which authority are you to believe? When the numbers on both sides are roughly equal and their capabilities are on a par, we have no way to decide which opinion to accept. Suppose, however, that a patient has been thoroughly examined by 5 doctors who specialize in the area of the patient's complaint, and 4 of the 5 independently recommend one treatment, and only one of the 5 recommends a different treatment. The patient will likely follow the advice of the majority of doctors, and rightly so. It is always possible for one authority to make a mistake, but the chances that 4 out of 5 will be wrong and only 1 out of 5 will be right are not high. We are not saying that judgments backed by a majority are always right, but, other things being equal, it is best to believe the majority opinion. Other things being equal, the broader the consensus among knowledgeable sources about a particular point, the greater the force of their authority as support for that point. Conversely, the greater the disagreement among capable sources about some point, the weaker the force of an appeal to the authority of any one of them is. Other things are not always equal, however. Sometimes there is good reason for questioning the majority opinion or even going along with the opinion of a lone dissenter. When a theory is being challenged, for example, or when a new technology is being used for the first time, the prevailing opinion of the experts can turn out to be mistaken. Each case must be judged on its own merits. Credibility. Imagine the following situation. The claim in dispute is straightforwardly empirical, and so setting it by an appeal to authority would seem clearly appropriate. Moreover, the arguer has appealed to the authority of a scientist who specializes in the field under consideration and who, in fact, has researched the question extensively. In other words, the arguer's source has both the competence and the opportunity to make a reliable judgment about the claim. Finally, the claim is a simple one, so there is no reason to expect that there would be any dispute about it among scientists who investigate it. For example, suppose the question is whether the ingredient called retsin in Cert's breath mints has any bacteria-killing efficacy. Isn't this a case where an appeal to authority would be entirely appropriate? Well, you can't be sure. Suppose the scientist being quoted is employed as a biochemist by the company that manufactures Certs. Furthermore, suppose the biochemist is quoted in a press release aimed at answering the criticisms of a consumers group that claims retsin is a completely useless ingredient. Suppose further that the biochemist has just bought a house, is paying tuition fees for his 2 college-aged children, and has the prospect of a generous pension if he remains with the company until retirement. Should you accept the appeal to his authority in support of the claim of the efficacy of retsin? Clearly not, since the biochemist is under too much pressure to toe the company line and not be candid. The point is not that he is surely lying. The point is instead that because of his conflict of interest, we cannot be confident he is being completely candid. As a scientist devoted to the pursuit of knowledge, he has an interest in telling the truth, even at the risk of losing his job. As an employee who needs the income and wants the security, he has an interest in keeping his job. In general, then, an appeal to authority is proper only if it would be unreasonable in the circumstances to challenge or to question the reliability. An appeal to authority is proper only if it would be unreasonable in the circumstances to challenge or to question the reliability, honesty, trustworthiness, or dependability of the source. This requirement is what we call the credibility condition. Fallacy of improper appeal to authority, therefore, occurs when the appeal is made in an argument under conditions where the appeal is inappropriate, where the authority cited is incompetent, or has not had the opportunity to determine the truth of the claim, where there is no consensus among the authorities, or where the credibility of the authority is in question. These conditions are summed up in the box on page 172. Although it is not a separate condition of the fallacy, we would add that unless the authority appealed to is identified in some way so that conditions B and D can be checked, an appeal to authority will be suspect. If the appropriateness or consensus condition is not met, an appeal to authority will be a fallacy violating the relevance requirement of good arguments. Failure to meet the credibility or the capability condition violates the sufficiency requirement. Improper appeal to authority. 1. An arguer appeals to the authority of some source to support a premise or to support the main conclusion in an argument. 2. There is good reason to think that any one or more of the conditions for a proper appeal to authority is not sufficiently satisfied. These conditions are A. The appeal must be appropriate. B. The authority must be capable, i.e. the authority must be competent and must have the opportunity to determine the truth of the statement. C. There must be fairly wide consensus among authorities in that area about such matters. And D. The authority must be credible. Let us put the general discussion to work on some examples of arguments in which appeals to authority are found. On the subject of the viability of nuclear energy as a source of power, the writer of the following letter to a newspaper came out against it. Quote, "It might be profitable for some journalists to check up on what one of the pioneers in the field of atomic physics had to say about atomic energy some 40 years ago. Toward the end of his life, Professor Millikan of the University of Chicago wrote his autobiography, which appeared about the time that atomic energy plants were being projected. In his book, he makes the flat statement that as a major source of power, atomic energy has no future. It is out. He does not elaborate, but he must have had solid reasons for this opinion, which he must have stated elsewhere, probably in professional journals." End quote. Note first that the writer's appeal to Professor Millikan is guarded. He says that it might be profitable to consider Millikan's views. Reading this letter, we can't be sure just what the author wants to establish by this appeal to authority. Does he simply want Millikan's views considered, or does he want them considered true? Read further. The writer goes on to surmise that Professor Millikan must have had solid reasons for his opinion that atomic energy is out. Thus, the writer seems to think that atomic energy has no future. He takes this view because it was Professor Millikan's view, and he invites us to do the same. Interpreted this way, the writer is making an improper appeal to authority. He does not even mention Millikan's reasons for believing that atomic energy is out. Sufficient for him is the fact that Millikan, an authority, held that view. We can see that the appeal is fallacious if we isolate the claim. Atomic energy has no future as a major source of power. What sort of statement is that? To begin with, it is not a statement from the domain of theoretical physics, Millikan's field of competence. Nor is it a statement that would belong to some branch of technology or applied science. In fact, it's a complicated statement that involves judgments about technology, business and industry, ecology, and lifestyles. If anything, as a claim about how a country should organize its energy production, it is a statement of social policy. As such, it necessitates numerous reasoned value judgments of a social nature, and on such issues, the prospect of a consensus is slim indeed. So the writer has violated both the capability and the consensus conditions, and hence has made an improper appeal to authority. In the next example, notice how the respect that people have for intelligence and achievement can too easily lead them astray. The writer is responding to an earlier letter that had accused some Christians of being dogmatic and narrow-minded. Quote, "One naturally wonders how the writer would class the late Sir Winston Churchill, whose words convey what he thought about Holy Scripture. According to Churchill, everything written in the Bible is literally true." End quote. The argument seems to be that it is not dogmatic and narrow-minded to claim literal truth for statements in the Bible because Churchill said the Bible expresses the literal truth. This appeal to Churchill's authority violates both the capability and the appropriateness conditions. First, it is doubtful that Churchill was an authority on the Bible. He was widely admired as a statesman and influential as a politician. However, these are not qualifications for authority in biblical exegesis. You might make a case that Churchill was an authority on history. He did publish several historical works, but his field of specialization was English-speaking peoples and, more narrowly, World War II. He was not a biblical historian. Second, many of the statements made in the Bible belong to theology, not history. For example, the claims that God gave the 10 Commandments to Moses, or that Christ is the Son of God, presume religious belief. Such claims are matters of religious faith, not empirical knowledge, or so we would argue. Religious beliefs of this sort cannot be empirically known by anyone, or if they can, there is at least no one in a position to vouch for their truth whose authority on their behalf can then be appealed to. Hence, although Churchill had some authority in one area of history, attempting to transfer that authority to a different area was an improper appeal to authority. Moreover, the writer attempted to make this transfer to an area where appeals to authority are inappropriate. Here is another example of an appeal to authority in another letter to a newspaper. Quote, "May I bring to your attention the following statement made by Dr. Joseph DeLee? He was one of the most eminent obstetricians of this continent, and he devoted his entire life to the improvement of obstetrical care. He said, quote, 'At the present time, when rivers of blood and tears of innocent men, women, and children are flowing in most parts of the world, it seems silly to be contending over the right of an inalienable atom of flesh in the uterus of a woman. No, it is not silly. On the contrary, it is of transcendent importance that there be in this chaotic world one high spot, however small, which is against the deluge sweeping over us. If we of the medical profession uphold the principle of sacredness of human life and the right of the individual, even though unborn, it will prove that humanity is not yet lost and that we may ultimately obtain salvation." End quote. The writer appears to be using Dr. DeLee's authority as an eminent obstetrician to support the view that abortion is wrong. Dr. DeLee was undeniably at one time an authority on obstetrics, as a check of who was who in America shows. He was, for example, the author of 4 books on obstetrics, one of which, The Principles and Practice of Obstetrics, originally published in 1913, went through 7 editions. Dr. DeLee was an authority on obstetrics, but that does not qualify him as an authority on the subject of the morality of abortion, an issue that belongs in the field of ethics. Thus, the competence condition has been violated by the writer. Furthermore, it is not clear whether the proposition that abortion is wrong can be a matter of knowledge. Since it is hotly disputed whether there can be any moral knowledge, there is no justification for taking it for granted that there can be an appeal to authority on this topic. So the author has violated the appropriateness condition as well. In the letter from which the following excerpt is taken, the writer was criticizing an earlier article about Down syndrome that had appeared in the Windsor Star. Quote, "I believe the Star is doing a great service to the mentally in the Windsor area by its recent articles on the subject of However, I wonder why David Gibson was quoted in this most recent article. His statements are not supported by other researchers in North America, Great Britain, or Europe." End quote. In an editor's note, the Star responded, quote, "Dr. David Gibson is a Canadian expert in his field. He is president of the Canadian Psychological Association, professor of psychology at the University of Calgary, editor of the Canadian Psychologist, and has spent more than 30 years in active work with the mentally." End quote. Having listed Gibson's impressive credentials, the Star then adds, quote, "There are those equally learned in the same area who disagree with him, an occurrence that is commonplace in most professions." End quote. The crucial phrase in the Star's attempt to defend its appeal to Gibson is in the last sentence. Since the Star gives no reason for citing Gibson's views rather than those of his equally learned dissenting colleagues, it violates the consensus condition. Where there are degrees of authority within an area, there is stronger justification for an appeal to a widely recognized authority than to one less well known. However, where opinion among the top authorities is divided, as was apparently the case here, no appeal to authority can carry persuasive force. As you can see, an appeal to authority in an argument can violate more than one of the conditions of proper appeals. The violation of any one condition undermines the argumentative force of the appeal. But some violations are more grievous than others. If the appropriateness condition is not met, there is no way to patch up that part of the argument. A source's competence, opportunity, or credibility can come under question, but in some cases, the critic's worries can be allayed by presenting additional evidence showing these doubts to be without foundation in the case in question. If the source is not competent to serve as an authority, no evidence of opportunity can strengthen the appeal. But if competence is established, then the question of opportunity can be addressed. Violations of the appropriateness and the competence part of the capability conditions are the most damning of charges against an appeal to authority. The key to appraising any appeal to authority rests on your capacity to delineate carefully the general field or area to which the statement in question belongs. You must then make a judgment about whether this is, indeed, an area in which any appeal to authority can be appropriate. By the way, when you challenge an appeal to authority, you are not thereby questioning the claim itself. Your point is that the argument fails to support the conclusion, not that the conclusion is false. Hence, if your point is that there has been an improper appeal to authority, it would be irrelevant for you to direct your criticism against the acceptability of the claim. Here is an imaginary exchange to illustrate this mistake. Quote, "Psychology major. Everything we do has some motivation, conscious or unconscious. Freud said so. Logic student. That's an improper appeal to Freud's authority. Lots of behavior, like tying your right shoelace before your left one, is just happenstance or habit." End quote. We're not endorsing the psychology major's appeal to Freud, but the logic student's rebuttal takes the wrong tack. When someone appeals to an authority, that person is giving a kind of reason for the claim. To say an appeal is improper is not to say that the claim is false, but that the reason given for the claim, that the authority said so, is not a good one in this instance. So the relevant critique is to show why it is not, which is where the conditions of the fallacy are intended to help out. The logic student should have said that the psychology major's appeal to Freud here was illegitimate, because authorities in psychology disagree about whether all behavior is motivated, and they disagree about the truth of the theory of unconscious motivation. In our terms, the consensus condition has been violated in this case. Rule: when charging improper appeal to authority, focus on the appeal to the authority, not the truth of the claim. Appeals to authority are perilous. They are sometimes arguments of last resort. The 13th century philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas even went so far as to say that, quote, "the argument from authority is the weakest of all arguments," end quote. Don't try to trip us up on the principles we've just listed because, you guessed it, we aren't appealing to Aquinas' authority. You don't have to take his word for it, or ours for that matter. With the conditions for proper appeals to authority in hand, check out arguments from authority for yourself. Popularity. The noted American philosopher and psychologist, William James, provides an example of specious reasoning that illustrates the fallacy we take up next, popularity. An anecdote from James's pragmatism serves to illustrate the kernel of this fallacy. James and a group of his friends had gone camping in the mountains. While James was away from the campsite on a walk, the remaining members of the party got into a heated dispute. James tells us what he found upon his return. Quote, "In the unlimited leisure of the wilderness, discussion had been worn threadbare. Everyone had taken sides and was obstinate, and the numbers on both sides were even. Each side, when I appeared, appealed to me to make it a majority." End quote. James, of course, did what philosophers are famous for. He drew a distinction that he thought resolved the issue. But suppose he had sided with one group rather than the other. Would that have made its view the correct one? If you think so, then beware the fallacy of popularity, which consists of thinking that if most or the majority of people believe something, then it must be true. For many, the popularity or widespread acceptance of an idea is an index of its truth, while a lack of acceptance is often construed as an index of its falsity. In its purest and most blatant and rarest form, the fallacy of popularity occurs whenever an argument proceeds from the popularity of a view to its truth. Thus, 1. Everyone believes P, therefore, 2. P is true. Instead of everyone, the argument may refer to almost everyone, or most people, or majority. The flip side of the argument also occurs. 1. No one believes P, therefore, 2. P is false. Instead of no one, the reference may be to almost no one, or very few, or nobody I know of. This move is so outrageous, when baldly stated, that the fallacy of popularity rarely occurs in such a blatant form. You often have to dig below the surface to find it. For example, Ari expresses the belief that smoking marijuana is harmful and urges Bart to stop using it. Bart counters, "Oh, come off it. Nobody believes that nowadays." Bart has not actually said that because nobody believes it. It is false. But that is the clear implication. Hema says that people should not engage in sexual relations until after they are married. Shai responds, "That's conservative claptrap, and everyone I know agrees with me." Shai seems to be saying that his claim gets its support from the agreement of his circle of friends. The best way to counter such a move is to ask, point blank, "Hold on, are you saying that because everyone or no one in your group believes it, therefore it is true or false?" Here is an example of the fallacy from a letter to a newspaper in which Concerned argues that laws should be more strictly enforced and that the courts should be handing out stiffer penalties. Quote, "Every other person with whom one discusses this problem will say that the time has arrived when the lash will have to be reintroduced in our courts. Concerned." End quote. Concerned stops short of saying that since this is what most people believe, it is true. But if that is the implication, the fallacy of popularity has been committed. To argue that a claim is true simply because a certain number of people think it's true is outrageous. However, we doubt that most people who are guilty of the fallacy of popularity are following this line of reasoning. Instead, we expect they reason implicitly as follows: that many people believe something is a good reason for thinking it is true, or at least believing it too. That's because, so the reasoning goes, there would not be popular acceptance of that belief unless there existed, independently, good reasons for thinking it to be true. Where there's smoke, there's fire. Hence, so the thinking goes, the popularity of the belief is some evidence of good reasons for accepting it. The key premise in this argument is that the widespread acceptance of a proposition provides good reasons for believing it. We are not saying here that the popular acceptance of a belief is never a reason for believing it. Suppose you find that everyone in a community you are visiting believes the fish in a nearby lake are contaminated. That would, by itself, be a reason for you to believe that the fish truly are contaminated. The point is not that their believing it makes it true, but instead that everyone's believing it is an indication that there is evidence for the claim. So popular belief is not always an irrelevant reason for accepting a proposition. However, the mere acceptance by numbers of people of a belief cannot be relied on as a good reason for you to believe it. If people were generally in the habit of arriving at their beliefs in a reasonable way, by considering all the relevant evidence, weighing it, and so on, then a consensus of opinion would be as impressive in ordinary life as it is, say, in the case of science. But evidence that people actually do this is meager. Instead, people are persuaded by bad arguments, they're duped by fallacies, they judge first and think afterward. They fail to search out and review the evidence. They face the limits of time and energy. If all this is true, the appeal to popular consensus, even as an indicator of what is probably true, is fraught with pitfalls. Of course, in arguing against the reasonableness of popular opinion as a basis for belief, we are not supposing that the appeal to popularity is always intended as a reasonable argument. Much of the time, it's a tool of intimidation, an attempt to browbeat a person into accepting some claim. Still, it gets some of its influence by hiding behind the facade of good argument. You need to see it as the facade it is. In the absence of any strong connection between the quantity of people who hold a position and its truth or probability, the appeal to popular acceptance is a fallacy. The conditions for it are listed in the box. Popularity. 1. Someone claims or implies that a proposition is true or credible and offers as support that it is widely accepted. Or someone claims or implies that a proposition is false or not believable and offers as support that it is widely rejected or not widely accepted. 2. In the circumstances, the popularity or unpopularity of the proposition is not an adequate reason for accepting or rejecting it. For several reasons, people find the appeal to popular acceptance attractive. In the first place, going against the grain of popular opinion can be experienced as threatening. We haven't forgotten the one in every crowd sort who loves to disagree with everyone. Peer pressure is difficult to resist. Second, two perfectly respectable principles provide masquerades for popularity: majority rule and popular sovereignty. A brief discussion of each of these may help you to detect popularity when it gets passed off as one of the others. Majority rule. This is the principle that what the majority of members of a decision-making group agrees to is what should stand as the decision of the whole group. The principle does not imply that the decision thus arrived at is true or right or the best one, but only that this is an effective way to carry on the group's affairs. It could be replaced by a principle that calls for 75% in favor or unanimity before motions are passed. The majority rule principle is a procedural one. It is a procedure for decision-making. Behind popularity, in contrast, lies a criterial principle. The appeal to popular acceptance offers the fact that most people embrace a claim as the criterion of its truth or plausibility. By failing to distinguish the procedural principle from the criterial principle, people can make the mistake of invoking majority rule as the justification for a belief. Popular sovereignty. Related to majority rule, and sometimes used to help justify it, is the political principle of popular sovereignty, the principle that says that law should be based on the will of the populace. The foundation for this principle is the idea that the people are sovereign and their views and attitudes should be reflected in the laws of the land. This is an important principle because if the laws of a country stray too far from widely shared beliefs about the sorts of conduct and policies that ought to be legislated, people will begin to lose sympathy with the laws, and respect for the law is needed for a well-ordered and flourishing society. Even as a political principle, popular sovereignty needs qualification. Popular opinion on some issues changes more rapidly than the law can or should. Also, it can be argued that legislators should have a role in influencing popular opinion as well as representing it. The principle of popular sovereignty should not be confused with, and cannot justify, appeals to popular acceptance as a basis for beliefs. The former makes no claim for the wisdom of the people or the worth of their preferences, but only for their right to influence policy, to have their interests served. Appeals to popular acceptance, in contrast, take the further step of supposing that what the majority or any large number of people believes is true or plausible. Against this background, consider the following statement, which was made after the 1992 elections. During that election in Colorado, a proposal to remove the protection of gay and lesbian rights in state legislation was passed. Quote, "The citizens of Colorado have spoken and decided. Gays and lesbians do not deserve the protection of the law." End quote. Is this an instance of the fallacy of popularity, or is it really an appeal to the principle of popular sovereignty? If the author is simply pointing out what the majority of Colorado voters on the issue wanted, then there is no fallacy. Indeed, there is no argument. But if the author is contending that gays and lesbians should not receive legal protection against discrimination because the majority of Colorado voters declaring themselves on that issue said so, then she is guilty of the fallacy of popularity. The Colorado vote decided that their state would be prohibited from doing something. In other words, popular sovereignty was exercised. But the vote does not prove that the majority was correct in its opinion. It would be quite consistent to acknowledge the authority of the vote while maintaining that the majority was wrong. As a concluding note, we add that something like an appeal to popular acceptance is found in many advertisements. Quote, "Chrysler minivan, the best-selling van in America." End quote. Quote, "More than 250,000 hairdressers the world over believe in what L'Oreal hair coloring can do for you. What more can we say?" End quote. 250,000 hairdressers can't be wrong. Here the assumption is that popularity is a criterion or index of the quality of a product, an assumption not far removed from taking popularity as an index of the truth of a belief. That assumption is questionable. Honda outsells Mercedes by a wide margin, but which are the better-built cars? Although not necessarily false in these particular cases. However, because advertisements have their own special logic, we will not multiply examples here, preferring to leave our confrontation with advertising until Chapter 11. Slippery slope. A common and perfectly legitimate way to assess a policy or a proposed course of action is to draw inferences about its likely consequences. If the proposal can be shown to have undesirable consequences, then that becomes a strong, though not decisive reason for not embracing it. It is not decisive because the alternatives might have even worse consequences. Much debate and argument about social policy therefore takes the form of making causal projections. So long as the causal claims that lie at the heart of such projections are well-founded, there is no logical problem. However, it often happens that in haste to discredit a policy, the critic fails to provide close argumentation to support the causal claims. When the causal projection is weak because one or more links in the causal chain are dubious and either not defended or sufficiently justified, then one form of the fallacy we call causal slippery slope is the result. There are two typical forms of argument employing such causal forecasts. In one, the whole series of causal steps is included. 1. If we do/allow A, then B will result. 2. If B happens, that will cause C. 3. Once C occurs, then D is inevitable. 4. If D happens, it will bring about E. 5. But E would be a terrible eventuality. 6. Therefore, we should not do/allow A. For example, if abortion is legalized, it will become widespread. If it becomes widespread, respect for human life will weaken. If respect for human life weakens, our form of civilization will be jeopardized. It would be folly to risk weakening our form of civilization. Therefore, abortion should not be legalized." End quote. In the second form, just the first and last chapters of the causal story are included in the argument. 1. If we do/allow A, that will lead in due course to Z. 2. Z would be catastrophic. 3. Therefore, we should not do/allow A. For example, quote, "The legalization of abortion will be the first step along a road that can only end in the weakening of our form of civilization. Surely we don't want to jeopardize our form of civilization. Therefore, we must not permit abortion to be legalized." End quote. The argument is fallacious when there is a link in the causal chain that is open to objection and not defended, a violation of the acceptability requirement, or when, although a controversial link is defended, the defense is questionable, a violation of the relevance or the sufficiency requirement. The following examples illustrate both forms of the fallacy. First, the long form. United Auto Workers President Owen Bieber, in a letter to Newsweek magazine, objected to the praise a Newsweek article had given to Japanese automakers who were building plants in the United States. Pointing out that only 30% of Japanese cars were manufactured in the United States at the time, Bieber wrote, quote, "To make matters worse, Japanese auto firms, collectively, put less than 40% of American parts in their transplant cars, compared to 90% for the big three. They have shunned traditional United States parts makers, including those that meet or exceed their quality and cost standards, preferring to import key components from Japan or buy them from an estimated 250 Japan-based suppliers that have migrated here. This buying within the family is destroying a major United States infrastructure at a cost of tens of thousands of jobs. It threatens to turn the United States into a branch plant economy in which we supply basic materials and relatively unskilled labor, while many of the most important technology and higher-order skills remain in Japan." End quote. Bieber is arguing that even for their United States manufacturing plants, Japanese automakers choose to either import parts from Japan or buy them from Japanese parts companies in the United States. These practices are responsible for massive job losses in the United States at the auto parts manufacturing level. These job losses then cause the loss of technological and higher-order manufacturing skills. The absence of homegrown technology and skills would cause the United States to have to import them from Japan. As a result, All that the United States would have left to supply would be basic materials and relatively unskilled labor. It would have become a branch plant economy. In short, Bieber argues that the present manufacturing practices of Japanese automakers in the United States will start a causal chain, leading down a slippery slope that will end, finally, in the United States becoming a branch plant economy supplying raw materials and unskilled labor to Japanese manufacturing overlords. Tacit in Bieber's argument is the assumption that such an eventuality is highly undesirable. From that missing premise and the causal chain he alleges, Bieber implies the conclusion that Japanese automakers should not be permitted to continue their present objectionable practices in the United States. We think there are problems at a couple of points in the causal chain that Bieber projects. First, tens of thousands of jobs is a vague number but sounds like a lot. Precisely how many job losses can be traced to the practices of Japanese automakers in the United States? Accepting Mr. Bieber's figures, it looks like that 40% of American parts in their transplant cars is 40% more than would be there if the cars were all made in Japan with 100% Japanese-made parts. Admittedly, if only American cars were selling in the United States, then 100% of the work needed to build those cars would be in this country. However, that suggests that the problem is competition from Japanese auto sales, whether imported or made in the United States, not the Japanese auto parts sourcing practices. Moreover, the parts supplied by Japanese companies operating in the United States are made with United States labor, using technology located in the United States. So we think Bieber's claim that Japanese practices in American car making are producing unemployment in the United States auto industry partly misidentifies the cause of the unemployment and is partly just wrong. Second, we question whether the loss of jobs in the United States, considerable though it may be, amounts to the destruction of the American auto parts manufacturing infrastructure. That is a very strong claim and requires defense. Third, we think that Bieber just gets carried away when he suggests that the destruction of the auto parts manufacturing industry in the United States amounts to turning the entire United States economy into a branch plant, merely supplying relatively unskilled labor and basic materials to foreign-owned manufacturers. We grant that the auto industry is a large component of the American industrial giant, but it is not the only one. And even if it were vastly reduced, it's far from clear that other industries would not emerge to take its place. The catastrophic outcome Bieber foresees, if it ever occurs, is not going to be caused just by the truncation of the United States auto parts industry by Japanese branch plant practices in the United States. For all these reasons, then, we think Bieber is guilty of the slippery slope fallacy in his letter to Newsweek. The next example illustrates the short form of this fallacy. When the use of seat belts in cars was being made mandatory, one of many who objected wrote to the newspaper as follows, quote, "If they can make us swallow this infringement on our personal rights, what's next? A seat belt law for the bedroom so we won't fall out of the bed and hurt our little selves? Boy, when Big Brother watches us, he really watches us, doesn't he?" End quote. The argument here seems to be that the seatbelt requirement is the first step down, an incline leading to a veritable 1984, Big Brother watches us. But how, precisely, is this horror to come about? The intervening steps are not mentioned, except for a sarcastic reference to seatbelts in the bedroom. We are given the first and the last chapters, but nothing in between. Most will agree that if the legislation were the first in a series of steps leading inevitably to the confiscation of all individual rights, then it should be rejected. From our vantage point, many years later, of course, we can see that the writer's prediction has not been borne out, but even at the time the projected outcome was dubious, and the author offers us no reason to expect it. Though it does not bear directly on the charge of causal slippery slope, we think it worth pointing out the potential mischief of the classification of the seatbelt law as an infringement on our personal rights. In one obvious sense, the law does take away a person's right, the right, if you will, to choose whether to use a seatbelt. On the other hand, it may be argued that no citizen has the right to take an unnecessary risk when the consequences of that risk must be borne by the rest of society. Since the evidence shows that the probability of severe injury and death is decreased when seatbelts are used, it could be argued that refusal to wear them constitutes an unnecessary risk. Second, the costs of automobile injury and death, police and court expenses, hospitalization, unemployment, have to be paid by the family or shared by other citizens. If this argument can be cemented, then the phrase infringement on our personal rights is of dubious application here, and we have a case of the fallacy of freeloading term in this argument as well. The conditions necessary for the fallacy of causal slippery slope are listed in the box. Causal slippery slope. 1. Someone claims that if an action or policy is permitted, it will set in motion a chain of events that will eventually, through a series of more or less fully elaborated causal steps, lead to a particular outcome. 2. The person claims or argues that this outcome is undesirable and that, therefore, the initial action or policy that will set in motion the chain of events leading to it should not be permitted. 3. At least one of the alleged links in the causal chain, whether defended, just claimed, or assumed, is questionable or false. In the short form of causal slippery slope arguments, just a jump from an initial action or policy to a final outcome is alleged. In the longer form, many or all of the intervening steps are described, but in neither the short nor the long form is sufficient evidence for the progression provided. The fallacy thus violates the sufficiency requirement of good arguments. Not every arguer who relies on the projection of a causal series into the future is guilty of causal slippery slope fallacy. Such reasoning is, in principle, perfectly legitimate. After all, if the causal links are plausible and the outcome is genuinely unappetizing, then the conclusion is well supported. For example, the following argument from a magazine article about fitness seems to us eminently reasonable. Quote, "If you don't get into the habit of exercising regularly when you're young, you are less likely to keep exercising during your late 20s and your 30s when career, home, and family take up more of your time and interest. You'll then tend to become sedentary and physically unfit. That will set you up for various heart and lung diseases during your middle years. No one wants to have a heart attack at the age of 45 or 50. To lessen that possibility, you ought to get into the habit of exercising regularly when you're young." End quote. The writer's argument seems cogent to us. The launching pad for the causal projection, not getting into the habit of exercising regularly when young, is followed by a series of claims qualified by less likely and tend to, so that the argument becomes a probabilistic one rather than one delivered with ironclad assurances. Causal slippery slope. Causal slippery slope should be distinguished from a form of legitimate argumentation it resembles, the appeal to precedent. Decision-making bodies, especially in government, must take into account the effects of the policies they set. One of these effects is the setting of a precedent. Consistency and fairness require that if one case is treated in a certain way, similar cases should be treated similarly. For example, if your city council grants the Ukrainian community a parade permit for its national celebration, that sets a precedent. Other groups with similar requests will expect to be granted the same permission, and rightly so. There is no logical misdemeanor in objecting to some plan or policy on the ground that it establishes an undesirable precedent. Such an argument will often be truncated, thus resembling the short form of the causal slippery slope argument, but in full regalia it would follow the form outlined in the box. The argument from precedent. 1. If we do/allow A, it will set a precedent that will justify doing/allowing similar actions, B, C, and so on. 2. B, C, and so on are undesirable. 3. Therefore, we should not do/allow A. The acceptability of such an argument depends primarily on whether the undesirable actions B, C, and so on are similar in relevant respects to the initial action A. If they aren't, then no precedent justifying B is established and the argument fails. The fallacy in that case is not causal slippery slope, for no causal chain has been projected, but faulty analogy. The first premise is unacceptable because the respects in which A and B, C, and so on are similar do not suffice to support the claim that if A is justified, then so are B and C, and so on. As we said, arguments from precedent are based on the requirement of consistency, that similar cases can be treated similarly. These arguments break down when two allegedly similar cases are not similar in the relevant respect. Arguments on the causal slippery slope pattern are based on the prediction of causal interactions. They break down when the evidence to support the causal chains predicted is weak or worse. Here's an argument we heard a professor make once that uses an appeal to precedent and flounders due to faulty analogy. Quote, "A student has asked me for an extension on her essay because her babysitter quit suddenly and she has to spend a couple of days finding a new one. It is time she had planned to devote to working on my essay, but I can't give her an extension. If I do, I'll have to give an extension to anyone who asks for one, and that would make a joke of having a deadline in the first place. It's important to have deadlines, both to force students to get down to work, to help them get projects completed before the end of the semester so all their work won't pile up at the end, and to give me a chance to grade and return the essays before the end of the semester. So I had to tell her, I'm sorry, but you'll have to take a late penalty." End quote. The professor was worried that granting an extension in this case would commit her to granting one in every case, and that setting such a precedent would undermine the whole practice of deadlines. Her argument makes the assumption that this particular student's reason for asking for an extension was similar in relevant respects to any other possible reasons other students might have. That assumption strikes us as indefensible. Not many college students have children and rely on babysitters. Moreover, that kind of excuse is, to our minds, a legitimate one, so if any other student asked for an extension on similar grounds, the professor should grant it. We agree with the reasons for having essay deadlines, but deadlines are not incompatible with, nor will they be undermined by, extensions for legitimate reasons. The professor feared granting an extension would set a bad precedent, but her fear was based on the assumption of a faulty analogy between the grounds for the request she received and any future request she might receive. Many textbooks use the term slippery slope to denote a quite different type of argument from either causal chain projections or the appeals to precedent that we have been examining, and we should draw it to your attention. Here's an example. Quote, "The official spring break starts on Monday, but to take advantage of the weekend before, many students leave school early Friday afternoon, skipping their afternoon classes. It's no big deal to miss a class or two, but if you're going to miss your afternoon classes, you don't miss that much more if you skip the morning classes too. So you might as well leave school Thursday night and get the extra day. But then why not leave early Thursday afternoon? To give yourself more traveling time so as to not be exhausted when you get to your destination. After all, Thursday afternoon's classes are for different courses from Fridays, so you're really just missing one class from each course. In fact, you might as well skip Thursday morning's classes too, since they belong to different courses as well. But that means it makes sense to leave for spring break on Wednesday evening of the week before the official vacation. And that is what you should do if you're planning to go away for a vacation." End quote. The reasoning in this argument is that since it is no big deal to miss one class, you can skip a second class without serious consequences. If you then add just one more to the number skipped, it still isn't serious, and so on. The trouble with this reasoning is that before you know it, you have missed not one but 4 or 5 classes, and that means you have a lot more work to make up than if you missed just the one. One writer has called this fallacy slippery assimilation. Others have it in mind when they use the term slippery slope. It's also called sorites, or the heap, because according to this argument, you could never make a heap of sand from a single grain because no single additional grain will make enough difference between what was there before it was added and what was there after to make a heap. Slippery assimilation seems to rely on a kind of faulty analogy of this form. If A is scarcely different from B, B is scarcely different from C, C is scarcely different from D, D is scarcely different from, and so on to Z, then A is scarcely different from Z. Try that reasoning next time you're stopped for speeding 30 miles per hour over the limit. Look, officer, 1 mile per hour over the limit is too close to call and not worth giving me a ticket for, but 2 miles per hour over the limit is only 1 mile per hour more than 1 mile per hour over the limit, so 2 miles per hour isn't worth a ticket either. And the same is true for the difference between 3 miles per hour and 2 miles per hour over the limit. And so, eventually, 30 miles per hour over the limit is only 1 mile per hour more than 29. So it follows from the line of reasoning that you shouldn't give me a ticket for going 30 miles per hour over the limit. Good luck. To end this section, we want to warn you about a further complication. Some arguments include aspects of both the causal slippery slope argument and the argument from precedent. Thus, someone might argue that a given policy will cause people to appeal to the precedent it sets, and following that precedent will cause undesirable consequences. An example is an argument such as the following, one you might have heard from one of your professors. Quote, if I give you an extension for your essay so you can do a better job, the word will get around, and others will ask for extensions on that ground too, since everyone can do a better job given more time. And then I'll have to grant extensions to everyone who wants one because there would be no difference between their claims and yours, and it's unfair to give you a benefit not extended to everyone in a similar situation. The more extensions I give, the more people will want them, and soon most members of the class will get extensions. But if nearly everyone can get an extension, then, in effect, the deadline won't mean anything, and that would be a bad result because people need deadlines to force them to get down to work. So I'm sorry, but I can't give you an extension so you can do a better job. End quote. We may be biased, but we think this argument is a good one. It combines claims about what actions will be caused by others with claims about what precedents will be set by an action. If you disagree, write and tell us what's wrong with it. By this point, you should be able to see that slippery slope arguments are tricky. There is a collection of similar yet distinct patterns of argument here. Each can have logically good instances and logically bad instances, and they can be combined, with the resultant combination patterns capable of logically good and logically fallacious instances too.